The United States just committed over $4 billion to build a railway across Africa. The goal? Break China's grip on the minerals that power your iPhone, your Tesla, and every AI data center on the planet. It's called the Lobito Corridor, 1,300 kilometers of railway connecting Angola's Atlantic coast through Zambia to the DRC's massive cobalt and copper mines. If it works, it cuts transport time in half, bypasses Chinese-controlled routes entirely, gives the US and Europe direct access to 70% of the world's cobalt. But here's the problem. China has a 15-year head start. They've invested $15 to $20 billion in the region. They control the mines, the roads, the railways, the ports. They built an entire ecosystem while America watched. So the question is simple. Is America too late? Or can a $4 billion railway actually break a 15-year monopoly? For investors, this could reshape the entire EV battery supply chain. For African countries, superpower competition creates leverage if you play it right. Let's break down what's actually happening. The Lobito Corridor is a railway rehabilitation project connecting three countries: Angola, Zambia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Here's the route. Starts at Lobito, a deep-water port on Angola's Atlantic coast. Runs east across Angola, crosses into Zambia through the Copper Belt, then extends into DRC's Katanga province, particularly Kolwezi, where roughly half of DRC's cobalt comes from. Total distance, about 1,300 kilometers. The centerpiece is rehabilitating the Benguela Railway, a colonial-era line built by the Portuguese in the early 1900s. It once moved minerals efficiently, but decades of civil war in Angola destroyed it. Large sections have been completely non-functional. The U.S. Development Finance Corporation approved a $553 million loan in October 2023. The European Union added over 300 million euros. The African Development Bank is involved. Total project cost for rail rehabilitation alone is $2.5 to $3 billion, with additional billions planned for connecting roads and energy infrastructure. The operator is Lobito Atlantic Railway, a consortium that includes Trafigura, the massive commodity trading company. And here's the update that matters. Construction has moved faster than expected. By mid-2025, a 260-kilometer section in Angola was already operational. Zambia's extension broke ground in December 2025. The full corridor is now targeting completion by 2027 to 2029, ahead of initial projections. So why does this matter strategically? First, it bypasses Chinese-controlled infrastructure. Currently, minerals from DRC and Zambia travel two main routes: the Tazara Railway through Tanzania to Dar es Salaam, or south through South Africa to Durban. Both are long, expensive, and increasingly Chinese-controlled. Lobito creates a third option: straight west to the Atlantic, then direct shipping to US and European markets. Second, the economics are compelling. Current transport from Kolwezi to international markets takes 35 to 50 days. Lobito targets 20 to 25 days, cutting time in half. Transport currently represents 15 to 25% of copper's value. If Lobito delivers a 40 to 50% cost reduction, that's meaningful savings across Zambia's 833,000 plus tons of copper and substantial DRC volumes. Third, it's about supply chain security. Chinese firms dominate 65 to 80% of DRC's cobalt through joint ventures. They control most of the transport infrastructure. Even if Western companies want to buy cobalt, they're dependent on Chinese logistics. Lobito breaks that dependency. The US and partners project $10 billion in annual trade once fully operational. That's copper, cobalt, manganese flowing west instead of east. Let's be honest about what America is up against. China started investing heavily in African infrastructure around 2006. That's when Belt and Road ramped up, when commodity prices were rising, when everyone could see Africa's mineral wealth mattered for the future. What did China build over those 15 years? The Tazara Railway, connecting Tanzania to Zambia, built in the 1970s, now getting an $800 million upgrade. Roads throughout DRC, connecting mines to ports. Multiple ports across East Africa with Chinese investment. Processing facilities, an entire integrated network. Total Chinese investment in Angola, Zambia, and DRC over the past 15 to 20 years? around $15 to $20 billion, according to Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. That's roads, railways, mines, processing facilities, a complete ecosystem. What was America doing? Focused elsewhere. Middle East wars. Financial crisis recovery. Pivot to Asia meant China containment, not African engagement. The result, by the time the US seriously engaged with African infrastructure around 2022, China had built an entire ecosystem. Chinese firms control majority stakes in major mining operations. They built the roads, they financed the railways, they have two-decade relationships with governments. The US DRC Lobito Corridor Memorandum wasn't signed until May 2023. The $553 million loan came October 2023. Construction really ramped up in 2024 to 2025. So America shows up with a few $billion and says, we're here to compete against $15 to $20 billion of established infrastructure and relationships. From a pure competitive standpoint, this looks like arriving very late to a game China has dominated for over a decade. But here's what matters. Infrastructure isn't permanent control. Railways deteriorate without maintenance. Relationships shift. Tazara, China's flagship African railway, fell into terrible condition over decades despite recent upgrade commitments. And geopolitically, African countries are increasingly wary of Chinese debt after watching Zambia's crisis. That creates an opening. Here's where we need to separate hope from reality. The challenges are real. African infrastructure projects have a mixed track record: delays, cost overruns, corruption, political instability. Angola just emerged from decades of civil war. DRC has virtually no functioning government in many mining regions. Armed groups control territory. Zambia just completed a debt restructuring and is hypersensitive about new infrastructure debt. China isn't sitting still either. They committed $800 million in 2024 to upgrade Tazara. They're expanding Dar es Salaam port, and crucially, Chinese firms control or have major stakes in many mines through joint ventures. If you're CMOC, a Chinese company with major DRC cobalt operations, you have existing contracts with Chinese logistics networks. Why switch to Lobito? And there's the maintenance question. Building infrastructure is one thing. Maintaining it for decades is another. Will the US and European partners commit to 30 to 50 years of maintenance funding? Or will this railway be in similar condition by 2050, deteriorated and needing another massive rehabilitation? But here's why it might actually work. First, market fundamentals. Copper around $9,400 per ton. Cobalt volatile but economically viable. These prices justify infrastructure investment. Mining companies will use whatever route is fastest, cheapest, most reliable. If Lobito delivers on cutting transport time in half and reducing costs 40 to 50%, companies will use it regardless of geopolitics. Second, diversification pressure. Both mining companies and African governments learned from COVID supply chain disruptions. Single route dependency is catastrophic risk. Even if Chinese routes remain primary, having Lobito as backup has enormous strategic value. Zambia, especially after their debt crisis, desperately wants alternatives to Chinese infrastructure dependency. Third, Western buyer demand. Tesla, Apple, Samsung, Volkswagen. They're all under regulatory and consumer pressure to secure ethical and diversified mineral supplies. They'll pay premiums for cobalt and copper flowing through transparent, Western-backed supply chains. That premium could be 5 to 10%, making Lobito viable even if baseline costs are just competitive. Fourth, multilateral coordination. Unlike many Chinese projects that are purely bilateral deals, Lobito has USDFC, European Union, and African Development Bank involvement. Multiple stakeholders create oversight, shared risk, and accountability that improve execution. The realistic assessment: Lobito probably won't beat China in any comprehensive sense. China's network is too extensive, too established. But Lobito doesn't need to beat China. It just needs to create viable alternative infrastructure that gives mining companies and African governments real choices. And that's more achievable than outright competition. Let me translate this into portfolio terms. If Lobito succeeds, even partially, It reshapes portions of the EV battery supply chain. Western mining companies operating in DRC and Zambia suddenly have competitive transport routes. Glencore, ticker GLEN on London, has roughly 25 to 30% of non-Chinese cobalt production in DRC. First Quantum, ticker FM in Toronto, dominates Zambian copper. If Lobito reduces their dependence on Chinese logistics, that's reduced political risk in their operations. Watch for potential re-rating higher if the corridor stays on its accelerated schedule. Supply chains become more diversified, not controlled by Chinese joint ventures and processing alone, but with Western Atlantic routes offering alternatives. That diversification reduces some geopolitical risk premium currently priced into these commodities. Battery manufacturers in the US and Europe get more reliable access to raw materials without going exclusively through Chinese intermediaries. That's worth substantial sums to Tesla, Panasonic, LG Energy. But here's the critical caveat. Full operational capacity comes 2027 to 2029 at earliest, with full volume potential beyond 2030. Any investment thesis around Lobito requires patience. Execution risk remains real, despite recent progress. The midstream angle is interesting too. Logistics and port infrastructure plays around Lobito in Angola could benefit. And watch how Chinese mining joint ventures respond, whether they use contractual terms to prevent mineral flows through Lobito, or whether market economics force them to use the cheaper route anyway. So what's the timeline? Next 2 to 3 years, the corridor either hits its 2027 to 2029 completion targets or stalls. If momentum continues, Western mining stocks with DRC and Zambia exposure get re-rated on reduced logistics risk. 5 to 10 years out, if Lobito achieves even 30 to 40% of projected $10 billion annual trade, it fundamentally changes the supply chain calculus for EV batteries. Now, let me give you the African lens, because this is where the real opportunity lies. For the first time in 15 years, Angola, Zambia, and DRC have two superpowers competing for access to their resources. That's negotiating power. The mistake would be choosing sides, going all in with the US or staying all in with China. The smart play is strategic neutrality. Play both sides for maximum benefit. What should African governments demand from both superpowers? Local processing and value add, not just railways to export raw ore. Require that 30 to 40% of minerals are processed in-country before export. That triples revenue and creates thousands of skilled jobs. Technology transfer. If the US is building railways, train African engineers to maintain and operate them. In 20 years, Africans should run this infrastructure independently, not remain dependent on foreign contractors. Revenue sharing. Railways generate enormous value through transport fees. African governments should demand significant revenue shares from logistics operations, not just token access fees. And transparency. Publish all contract terms. Parliamentary oversight. No secret deals with either superpower. Zambia learned this lesson through their debt crisis. The key insight: competition between lenders means better terms for borrowers. After Zambia's restructuring, African countries understand the cost of opaque deals and unsustainable borrowing. The message to both superpowers should be clear. We'll work with whoever offers genuine partnership, local jobs, technology transfer, fair revenue sharing, sustainable financing. The leverage belongs to whoever controls the resources. So, where does this leave us? The US committed a $553 million loan as part of a $3 to $5 billion multilateral effort, trying to counter China's $15 to $20 billion head start. The Lobito Corridor connects Angola's port through Zambia to DRC's mining regions. Target: cut transport time in half, eventually unlock $10 billion in annual mineral trade. Will it work? Not in the sense of beating China comprehensively, but it's working better than skeptics predicted. 260 kilometers operational by mid-2025. Full corridor targeting 2027 to 2029 completion. It creates viable alternative infrastructure that diversifies supply chains and gives African countries real leverage. For investors, watch Western mining stocks with DRC and Zambia exposure. Glencore, First Quantum. If Lobito stays on schedule, reduced logistics risk could mean re-rating higher, but patience required. Full capacity is 2027 to 2029 at earliest. For African countries, This is leverage. Two superpowers competing for your minerals means you can demand better terms. Local processing, technology transfer, fair revenue, transparent financing. Don't choose sides. Extract maximum value from both. The key question isn't whether the US can match China's past investment. It's whether competition produces better outcomes than monopoly for everyone involved. Next week, Africa's 10 richest economies in 2026. The rankings that will surprise you, and what they mean for where the continent is actually heading. Subscribe if you want African economic intelligence before mainstream media catches up. I cover the stories that move markets, from someone who actually lives this. I'll see you in the next one.